Okay, next we're gonna have Stephen from Harvard University presenting a paper on robots, foreigners, and foreign robots, policy responses to automation and trade. So it's this one.
Cool, thanks. Awesome, thank you. Cool. All right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Stephen Chaudoin, and this is co-authored with Michael David Mangini. He goes by MD, and he's a postdoc at Yale. And I want to start with a shameful confession, which is that in my day job, I actually study trade more so than automation. And when I talk to people in trade, roughly 97.5% of papers start with something like this, where they say, there is this very common and well-supported empirically narrative that says, the rise of China and other sources of major dislocation led to lots of bad isms and President Trump. So that anxiety and that dislocation creates a demand for these types of policies like protectionism. I don't disagree with this. But when MD and I started this project, we thought, similarly to Valentina, why are we not instead seeing 100 papers at IPES, a political economy conference, that say China caused Yang? Because if I am someone who has been dislocated, there's lots of ways to make me whole again. You could try and reshore with a tariff, or you could redenigrate me with better safety nets or with transfers. And these were things that were supplied in the marketplace of ideas. There's just very little uptake. So there are people very seriously talking about major redistributive policies like universal basic income. So why instead are we talking about China causing Trump instead of China causing President Yang? Similarly, why are we, at least in the IPE trade world, now just cottoning on to a reasonable question, which would say, why are we not instead writing 100 papers that said automation caused Trump? Something that people in this room have empirically detected, but I would say that this is not kind of a major part of the political narrative yet. And this too doesn't make sense, because if I lose my job to foreign competition or a robot, from a purely economic perspective, that shouldn't matter. So it's weird that we think that automation caused greater dislocation than trade, yet this is not the modal New York Times hysterical story. Okay. So MD and I would say that an important part of this answer actually has a lot of common themes with the two papers you just saw. And an important part of the answer is that you have to understand the ways that economic nationalism and comparative advantage trade collide. And so MD and I would say that it's important to consider whether people perceive the source of a shock as being foreign versus domestic, meaning is the origin of this shock and is its likely effects to increase my national vulnerability or to decrease my national production. And depending on what you think the origin of this shock is, this will change the way that you weight different options in a policy bundle. So bundle, I want to think about different things collectively, not just kind of in isolation. Does the shock make you demand transfers or protectionism or regulation? I want to think about the relative weights you place on different types of policies. And we'll categorize them in two ways. So type of policy number one, we will call backpedaling, which just means picture stacking up sandbags against the rising tide of this shock of globalization, or automation. So in the case of globalization, tariffs. In the case of automation, regulations. I think there's a couple of papers we'll see later that describe these as steering policies, which is another really good term for that. All right, so you can put emphasis on that backpedaling policy in your bundle of policies, or you can up your emphasis on transfers. And our argument is that if you are an economic nationalist, which many American voters are, then this will increase the weight that you place on backpedaling policies at the expense of transfers. In other words, as I get an intrinsic value from a backpedaling policy that I think does good things for the trade balance, this will crowd out some of my demand for transfers as well as increase my demand for backpedaling. We're only going to model citizens' demand for policies, but we think that in a supply and demand marketplace, politicians have a decent intuition for what things will take root. And so sensing this, successful politicians supply this policy. And we'll show this empirically with two survey experiments where we can first show things that I think we are probably not controversial, which is that if we show people prompts about foreign labor shocks versus domestic automation shocks, then they will have little demand for transfers in the former case and higher demand for protectionism. What I think is more notable is that if we kind of quote unquote make the automation shocks foreign and emphasize their foreign origins, then we can get people to treat them in a similar way that they treat globalization now. Okay. Why is this important? Well, first is retrospectively, I think this is just a helpful way to understand some of the weirdness of our current political moment. And then second, there are lots of ways that we can think about different shocks, and we hope that this model, the formal model that we'll show in a second, gives kind of a general workhorse approach to how we can think about ways that people balance bundles of policies. And we're not limited to just thinking about kind of Meltzer-Richards tax and redistribution or separate thread Grossman-Helpman tariffs. We can think about how people construct bundles of policies. And then third, the project is also kind of shamelessly forward-looking and speculative in the sense that we know that there's going to be we suspect that there's going to be a transition in the next 10 to 20 years where Silicon Valley will no longer be the sole tech mecca of the world. So this is an informal but recent survey of C-suite executives from American businesses saying that only 32% think that it's likely that Silicon Valley will stay at the center of the tech world. And our argument would be that this is part of the genesis of where we would see more meaningful automation regulations in the future. Okay. This audience is intimately familiar with this literature, so I'm going to focus only on two key characteristics. So we are certainly not the first to think about trade and automation. We're not even the first this morning to consider the importance of foreignness. So I'd say two important characteristics are that there's a lot of work about blame misattribution, none of which I think we would disagree with. But I think we would say we're interested in kind of the origins of blame because as a trade person, I'm old enough to remember 5 or 10 years ago when we would have thought of trade as incredibly low salience. And so I would have had to have persuaded my undergrads to care about Heckscher-Ohlin models. Now that's an easy sell because trade is super high salience. So blame is malleable, and we want to know more about the origin story of blame. And second, when we think about foreignness, there is work that compares automation prompts with globalization prompts, but it stops at kind of a presumption that trade is foreign and automation is domestic. And that presumption is accurate, I would submit. But there are lots of other differences between trade and automation. I might perceive different magnitudes in their effects. I might perceive that trade affects this type of person more so than that type of person. I might picture different foreign adversaries, things like that. So there's lots of differences between trade and automation, between their foreignness. So we want to zoom directly in on foreignness with what we manipulate. Okay. What does the formal model look like? I'll describe it kind of in less technical and broad strokes terms. But the way we should think about this is that I'm picturing a citizen who is observing the incomes of quote unquote winners and losers from a shock. Winners meaning kind of we all benefit from lower prices or better variety from globalization, or we all benefit from productivity gains from automation. But some of us are losers if we are directly displaced in our jobs, and that's a net loss for us. And so this person is observing a shock of magnitude A, which is going to increase aggregate gains for the country, but it's going to have distributive effects. It'll magnify incomes for the winners by some factor alpha, lower incomes for the losers by some factor alpha as well. And she can demand two types of policy responses. So one is she can demand policies that backpedal, so prevention policy Bs, things that backpedal against this shock, that just lower the magnitude of whatever that shock will be. And we think of this as continuous in the sense that you can imagine regulations of increasing severity or tariffs that increase in their magnitude. She can also have demand for a policy that transfers money from the winners to the losers. We'll make all of this kind of standard assumptions about the way transfers work to capture the idea that if I take $1 from the winners and I transfer it to the losers, I can't transfer the full dollar. There's some leakiness, and that leakiness is increasing in the degree to which I want to make transfers. Those last two things describe the first of her trade-offs, so the first kind of important contour of her decision, which is that she faces an efficiency versus a quality trade-off. So her utility is increasing in everyone's income. She doesn't hate anyone. This typical citizen wants everyone to be a little bit richer. But she also values equality in the sense that all else equal, having more equal incomes is better from her perspective. So she can do things like backpedal, which will decrease the magnitude of the shock, decrease the gains overall, but perhaps decrease the dislocative and distributive effects of the shock. Second contour is we want to then add nationalism. And for kind of time reasons, we won't talk about all the kind of different aspects of nationalism, but to group them in our minds, we think of this as things that describe reasons why you might have a preference for domestic production, like fear of competition, like Nicole was saying, or perhaps maybe you think there are internal distributive effects that you don't like based on your identity, whatever it is. In this case, we're just thinking of it as you like things that backpedal against shocks that are worsening your trade balance, that are making you more dependent on someone else. So anytime you are facing a foreign shock that you think will increase imports, you will gain some utility gamma P from prevention policy. Anytime you're facing a domestic shock, you gain disutility from this thing. If you thought, like Nicole was saying, that technology was good for your country's competitiveness, you get a disutility from backpedaling against that shock. Right, so the second contour that we describe is that getting this direct utility has a crowding out effect. I can demand greater tariffs or regulations, which will solve part of my redistributive problem and have this side benefit, meaning that I have a lesser demand for tariffs if these things are kind of strategic complements in this setup. Okay. I like pictures. So if you're picturing this, picture someone who has experienced a shock that has moved incomes down here, and because of whatever your preference contours are, you want to move incomes back up here. You're picking some allocation between those two things. You can move partially with transfers, and you can move partially with backpedaling. And what our model also does is shows that the key kind of thing that we want to think about is the relative weights that you place on these two things. It's super hard without tons of ancillary and hard to defend assumptions to describe exactly like the length of these vectors. But the model gives us a crisp prediction about the relative weights that you would put on these two vectors. All right, so if I was a nationalist facing a foreign shock, then my picture won't look like it just did. My picture might look like something like this in the top pane, where I have a much greater demand for backpedaling policy. I'm also not going as far, and I have less demand for transfer policy. My zeal for these kind of backpedaling policies has crowded out my demand for these transfer policies. The bottom picture might as well be titled, Nicole was right, because this is what she was describing. If I think I'm facing a shock, like a domestic productivity shock that will help my competitiveness, then I'm going to greatly shrink the weight, shrink the weight I place on policies that slow that adoption. Okay. So if I was thinking about this in two terms and to help us line up with what the experiment looks like, think about moving from the top left to the bottom right. Foreign labor shocks, people like protection, they don't like transfers, and as we move to the bottom right, they will downweight regulation, increase their weight on transfers. And then the second thing we'll show you is that if we focus only on the right column and make automation foreign, this will upweight people's preferences for regulation and downweight their preferences for transfers. Okay. The survey design is actually simple. Valentina gave us too much credit. Hers is actually much more creative. But our survey design is pretty simple. We're going to show people a realistic newspaper article about layoffs in an automotive plant, and we'll randomly assign them to one of four conditions: a labor or an automation shock that caused the layoffs, and that origin will be foreign versus domestic. We spent a lot of time making sure that these were identical in lots of ways. That required some pretty mild deception. We can talk about that, but I would submit that it's pretty benign. Everyone got a first page that looked like this. It's kind of a generic description of layoffs at an auto plant. And then within a fairly lengthy, detail-rich thing, we varied whether it was foreign labor versus domestic automation is the example given here. So what that meant is we changed the pictures a little bit. So this is labor automation. And foreign versus domestic would mean we would change a short sentence describing the origin of this shock. Foreign labor is things like shipping containers. Domestic automation, we show them a vaguely American company and talk about American technology. This is what domestic automation versus foreign automation looks like. The same up at the top, although we've changed two things. First, we've switched from a vaguely American company to a vaguely foreign company. We didn't want to put our thumb on the scale super hard by putting up something like Huawei in Chinese characters. So this is, in most Americans' minds, kind of vaguely foreign. And then we changed some sentences describing US companies developing automation technology versus European and Asian companies developing automation technology. Okay. Then people answered questions about how much they supported different policies, and everyone will get all three things. Should we increase transfers? Should we increase restrictions on imports? Or should we increase regulations on automation? And then the key thing is we'll calculate the difference in people's support for these policies. So we'll take the backpedaling policy support minus the transfer policy. Because as the model showed us, we really need to think about these relative things. Making point predictions about the magnitude of these is quite difficult. All right. We fielded this in 2020, and it's standard here as well. No huge red flags in terms of either balance or demographics or manipulation checks. And the results look like this. So I was going top left to bottom right. Moving from foreign labor to domestic automation greatly changes the difference in people's support for these things. So people want greater response in general to foreign labor treatments. That's not shocking. But when we go from foreign labor to domestic automation, they decrease the weight that they want on policy regulations and increase the weight that they want on transfers relative to one another. And then more importantly, when we go from domestic automation to foreign automation, it will increase the weight that people place on these regulatory measures, backpedaling, and decrease the weight that they place on transfers. And so people's relative bundles are shifting in the way that we would expect if people had some underlying economic nationalism in their preferences. That was tables. This is the same thing in tortured regression form to show that we're not smuggling anything in. So this is with and without controls. The first columns compare only domestic automation and foreign labor. The second two columns are comparing domestic automation and foreign automation. as we would expect, when we have either foreign labor or foreign automation, it's increasing the difference between these two policies. More weight on transfers, or excuse me, more weight on regulations. And keep in mind too that when I talk about domestic automation and foreign automation, this is the backpedaling policy here is regulating automation, not import tariffs. So this is not telling people about foreign robots makes them want to decrease imports. This is it makes them want to slow down automation adoption in general. We did a follow-up experiment in 2022 for a couple different reasons. One is that I don't know if people feel the ambient anxiety about replication, but we wanted to be sure for ourselves that these things replicated. They did so, fortunately, and in a different time period. 2020 was kind of more in the teeth of COVID. 2022, maybe unemployment concerns have laxed a little bit. We use a different setup, so it's not newspaper article vignettes. It's kind of a more generic information treatment, and things look the way we would have expected, and results are pretty consistent. In the second experiment, we also found nationalism moderation results, which were encouraging to us. We asked a pre-treatment question getting directly at the way we operationalize nationalism in the theoretical model. How much do you dislike imports? For people that dislike imports, those were the people for whom we found the largest treatment effects in increasing automation regulations. So not preferences for tariffs. Again, this is those types of people have a similar mental model that makes them want regulations on automation. We also varied kind of different flavors of foreignness. So we would give people treatment that emphasized foreign origin, and then we would give them an ancillary prompt that said something like, this could affect the degree to which the United States is dependent on foreign countries. Or this will potentially help the United States, but maybe helps the other country more. Or thinly veiled language that says this helps white people, basically, or affects white people. So this would be the language you would see in newspaper articles that says the shock has affected blue-collar workers in the heart of America. We kind of wanted to know what flavor created the dynamics we were seeing most. And it actually turns out to be the top two, which would be consistent with some of the things that Nicole was saying. People's preferences for self-sufficiency and concerns about relative gains move them more strongly. All right. So to conclude, if you want to elicit support for automation or AI regulations, I would submit that if you are a cynical politician, the way to do so would be to cast these things as foreign, which seems to be the direction that we're heading, at least in terms of if you look at trade data. So MD has done good work looking at how the trade imbalance in US automation technology is yawning and growing at a wider rate than kind of regular goods and services trade balances. And so when you make automation or robots foreign, you get similar reactions to what we saw in the last 10 years about globalization. Beatrice also asked Valentina a really good question about kind of, you're talking about old school robots, we did too, does that apply to AI regulation? And so before I got here, I wanted to make sure that I was up to date on kind of things that had happened in the AI regulatory sphere, and so I Googled it, and one of the top hits was this article. It's from May, but it was still one of the top hits from the Center for American Progress, where they are lamenting the fact that there has been virtually no meaningful progress on any AI or technological regulations, except for when stuff gets cast, as it did with TikTok, except for when stuff gets cast as foreign and a national security concern, et cetera. So I started with, this is shamelessly forward-looking. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, it seems like the data that is trickling in is consistent with that perspective, that if you want to get regulations, make things seem foreign. Okay. Thanks, y'all.
So Stephen gets his 10 minutes of questions. So we have 2 questions here. We have.
And I don't know everyone. Can I request that people say their names too?
Should I say my name? Victor.
We met this morning. Hey, Victor. Thanks.
Yeah, that was really neat, but I think you're assuming that the regulatory tools are homogeneous across tariffs and the regulation of, let's say, robots, when in fact, I think you should relax that assumption. Let me give you 2 dimensions. First, effectiveness. It seems that to levy a tariff, you can focus on ports of entry. And there's going to be leakage, but it seems much less leakage than if you try to tax robots. First of all, what's a robot? How do you assess the tax and how do you enforce it? It seems like there'd be much more leakage. On the other dimension is distortion. Now it goes the other way. In terms of the distortionary effects of a tariff, they're going to be more wide-ranging over, like, let's say, consumer goods. So you're going to get a higher cost across consumers and more disruption in terms of their behavior, let's say substitution to something else. Unless it's like a tariff on French cheese or something, but I don't assume you're talking about that. Whereas with robots, if you tax, let's say, robots in some niche sector, you're going to get much less distortion. So I wonder if this could drive the results in that less effective and less distortionary regulation on robots might drive some of that preference for, let's say, transfers versus regulation of robots. So just something to think about. You could relax that in the model and then see if it affects the results.
Thank you. I think we have Daniel here, or yeah, sorry.
Thank you. Super interesting and great work. And so I have a comment most on the last part and the importance, because it is true that it felt for a while that this literature was like forward-looking, and so there was not much policy debate. But I do think that now it's the opposite of it, that we are lagging behind. There's so much in terms of regulation going on. And if you read the 2024 AI report, like across countries, there's really a much, like in many domains that are more economic oriented, but also like at least in the EU, the AI Act and how it will translate into national legislations is becoming a major topic. And to me, it's interesting to follow it, but like just this assumption that we, a bit the common frame was more maybe addressed to the political economy literature than what I think now it's going on.
Hey, Stephen, I'm Daniel. So also really, really neat, good to see this. It makes a lot of sense, very clean. Something in your conclusion kind of surprises me, or maybe runs at odds with, I would say, other assumptions in the AI policy space. And they may not be strictly at odds, but essentially, I think the conventional wisdom in AI governance is when we're increasing strategic competition threat, we're not increasing support for AI regulation in the sense of limiting AI. We're actually increasing support for boosting AI. So we'll say, hey, the US is fighting with China, we need more R&D. We need to unleash AI, we need to accelerate AI. So quite the opposite direction. I think there's a story where both of those things make sense. Maybe it's a public opinion versus policy discourse, but just wanted to suggest that when we talk about the need to adopt AI regulation, there's very different types of instruments that are being promoted. And I think generally, Chips and Science Act, I think literally the US Innovation and Competition Act, it's all about boosting AI rather than regulating AI per se.
Bow, and then let's let Stephen answer.
Hi, Stephen. Thank you. I'm Bao. Thank you again for presenting this, and I've seen so many versions of this over the years, and I think this is a really fruitful research agenda. And at APSA, we had some colleagues from Italy who were in the audience and also on our panel that I went to, and it was like putting on the comparative hat. I do think that maybe doing this work in doing public opinion research with a European audience where there is a sort of a concern about automation that led to the EU AI Act because they want to protect human rights, but also I do think there is a sort of like the foreignness of a lot of these technologies, or they perceive it as, it's a US technology. So I think it might be fruitful to expand your project that way to take a more comparative approach. And then my second suggestion is that I do think there's maybe many angles to technology regulation that's beyond, like, let's slow down automation to protect workers, but like the concerns I expressed about protecting human rights in the EU and in the US, the rhetoric from the Biden White House with the AI Bill of Rights is protecting civil rights to make sure people are not being discriminated against, or their physical safety is not harmed. So I think it could be useful to untangle these concerns, but also perhaps these messaging could be tied together to like signal greater support for regulation by using sort of both both these types of rhetoric. Sorry, I'm just like very jet lagged. I hope it made sense.
Stephen, do you want to maybe go ahead and
Sure.
start answering?
Victor is 100% right when we think about comparing remedies like protectionism for trade versus regulation for automation. I think those two are, there's no way to unconfound those, since you might believe one is more efficacious than the other. I think we're on stronger footing though when we think about foreign automation versus domestic automation, because there the regulatory mechanism in both cases is the same. We're not saying tariffs for one and regulations for the other. So I think that helps us a little bit. It could always be ex post that people think that it's easier to regulate foreign technology than domestic technology. I don't have strong priors that would say that's the case, but that would be something worth checking. But you're totally right that there is that important kind of confounding with foreign labor, domestic automation, thankfully lessened with foreign automation, domestic automation comparisons. Ina is also 100% that this is that I should not treat this as such a U.S.-centric story because, like you said, there is regulation outside the United States. So I would say there's two things that we would say. One is that maybe this isn't as surprising to us because U.S. technology in those other regulatory spheres is foreign. So like Bao was saying, these are U.S. tech giants, which makes it potentially easier for the EU to reach for regulatory mechanisms. Now, I don't doubt that there is kind of a true like benevolence under a lot of these regulations, and like truly a preference for privacy or truly a preference for like good things. But I would also suspect that there was an easier path forward for a lot of those regulations, given that most of the tech giants are U.S. We did field a similar survey for some OECD countries in Europe, and there was just like an annoying survey glitch. They asked the dependent variable question wrong, which has made things really muddy. So I would agree with both you and Bao that we should have tried that. We did, and there was an expensive screw up. Okay. I would also agree with Daniel in thinking that we're essentially too focused on like old school Meltzer-Richards tax and transfer, but there are other mechanisms like boosting social investment or boosting job retraining or boosting investment in localities. Something that I think the Anelli and Gallego papers also do a better job than we do of highlighting. So I would 100% agree there. And it's not in this paper, but in some ongoing work, we've been looking at why it is that people are so anemic in their desire for kind of tax and transfer redistribution, and our answer as a remedy for globalization. And our answer there is that they may not have strong support for those things, but they do actually seem to have stronger support for things like social investment. And at least within the what responses do Americans want literature, it tends to focus more heavily on just old school tax and transfer, write a check to make someone whole, and not on social investment type things. Bao has seen this paper. We did start in 2020. Had 2 kids, so I'm gonna plead plead for some sympathy there. So it's been, you're right. It's been slow sledding. And as mentioned, I would 100% agree that we need to think about this as less U.S. centric. Though I suspect that EU regulations are easier since tech giants are American.
I'm gonna open the Q&A back for like all the papers. So we're gonna have 15 minutes from now on all the papers. So just let the authors know. Let's go with Kayleen and then Sorry. Hard here.
All right. I'll let everyone have a second to get settled. So I'm going to take it back to the beginning. My question is for Valentina. Valentina, I like what you're doing here with the mediation analysis. And my take on what you're doing is essentially getting at somewhat of controlled effects of the mediators. You're basically priming in a particular way people to reflect on nostalgia sorry, I'm trying to remember back to the beginning. What was the second mediator?
Marginalization.
Marginalization, exactly. And so I was wondering if it might be valuable to get at the more natural effects of these mediators as well, doing something like having an open-ended, a slightly more open-ended response, a free response, where they're reflecting on the impact of AI on their lives or society without the emotional priming or directly inducing them to think about that particular mediator that you're investigating, and then seeing who brings up naturally in their responses nostalgia or marginalization, and then also investigating the prevalence of those attitudes in responses overall, as well as potentially the prevalence of other mediators that could be influential in looking at the outcomes that you're observing. Thanks.
Should I?
Go ahead,
Okay.
yeah.
I like the idea so much that I already did. So I do have open-ended responses, and I have coded them. I haven't really. I mean, this is like a paper I should write in the next few years, but I haven't really explored what is in there. But yes, I have that, and I have open-ended questions because I think that if we do surveys, we need to go there. That's my view. So I do have that. I don't have like the answer of how that it works, but that's the next step. But it is there. Like I have the input already. Yeah. So great. You think that is a good idea. Thank you.
So this is a question for both Nicole and Stephen. So you're saying essentially that nationalism crowds out redistribution, but I'm also wondering a little bit about like the effects on the line, like the general equilibrium effects, because if we have this competition narrative that might strengthen the support for the idea of market fundamentalism, whereby workers end up accepting poorer conditions because they are at the whim of the market forces. So I was wondering if what can we learn from this to like kind of like also think about public policy if the ends up, for example, weakening workers' collective action and shifting legislation, as you say, away from distributive policies. And I think this is important because as we have seen precisely from the literature on trade, when redistribution is not working very well, then people are more prone to fall into these populist narratives and support them, and also to support more political extremism. Yeah, thank you.
I guess I'll go first. So I think it's very interesting to think about sort of like global competition workers and their current sort of treatment in their firms and sort of specific, institutions, like labor institutions that might affect them. I feel like I'm cheating a little bit by drawing on sort of my experience doing field work in China. I do feel like workers say so much about foreign competition, in part because their employers also say a lot about foreign competition, and the government also says a lot about foreign competition. I don't know if we have actual like data on the extent to which this narrative might like incentivize them to, tolerate worse conditions than they otherwise would get. But I can imagine a situation where, they can, like capital owners can use this narrative as to why you need to, tolerate automation. But I am not aware that we've done a lot of work, exploring the interplay between these three things that you mentioned.
The only work I would know of is yours, because this speaks to questions like whether you would support unions or better workplace conditions, things like that. For me, I don't have a good empirical answer either, other than I would wonder if there was a survivor bias in how people thought about this. If I keep my job, then I believe automation is labor complementing, and then that might affect my demand for workplace conditions or unionization. If I lost my job, then I might have very different preferences, and I'm not sure about how that would go down.
Another question to Stephen and Nicole. I find this interaction of automation and international competition very interesting. I was wondering if the difference in this domestic versus international source of automation has to do with where investment take place eventually. So if we think of the model of automation increasing productivity, and this increases the possibility to do investment, and also to decrease offshoring. So maybe automation can be perceived as something that increases the possibility that a certain industry remains in the country as opposed to like doing offshoring in a different context. So yeah, just want to know your thoughts about this. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question that we hadn't thought of actually. And if I understand right, you're saying sometimes people might think about foreign automation as build a factory in rural Alabama, which is probably a good thing in a lot of people's minds. I don't know how much people associate automation advances with like new groundbreaking FDI. But to the degree that they do have those thoughts in their mind, I suspect that would kind of bias against what we're finding, because presumably most people think that like new groundbreaking FDI is a good thing. So then it would be surprising for me to say, I like foreign investment, they're gonna build a factory, but now I want to slow automation. So the degree that people have that as part of their mental model, I would think that would bias against finding increased support for slowing the roll on automation.
Oh, hello, Brandon DeBrol, Rand Corporation and USC. I'm curious about two items. One is, and this may be a broader question for the panel on the underlying economic strength. So it seems to me that some of these things are tied to how well your economy is performing and when, and you probably fear more automation challenges when your economy is doing poorly, and then maybe it's a little bit less. I mean, so I'm kind of curious across all of the elements, both in the desire to regulate and the sort of the responsiveness, is like how much of this is just the economy's changing business cycle sort of problem. And I'm curious if folks found evidence of that or no evidence of that. Either would be interesting. The second element is my concern around the linking automation findings to the current posture of AI. And this is because, so I've done quite a bit of work at RAND on looking at tasking systems. So like where you look at productivity replacement rates at taskings with the automated tools that you're actually using. And what we find is that people aren't actually losing their jobs, their tasks are changing. And so the task substructures, if you think like Asimoglu's piece where he thinks through like the task substructures, it seems that actually what's happening is firms are demanding more productivity for the treatment of AI than none. Right, so it's not really the automation story in the same way, because really AI seems like a different good category than what is being replaced by automation. I'm curious what folks' thoughts are on that, like that, given that this is like being exported to this AI construct. Over.
Is it Chris? Did you? Brandon, I am so sorry to follow up on your point about how it's not just a story about displacement. I'm curious, how have you thought about the quality of work in general for these workers in that automated decision-making is impacting their day-to-day, how they're being evaluated by HR, and then also Karen Levy at Cornell has written a lot about digital surveillance of workers, particularly truckers is her main focus, where they're not being, their jobs are not being displaced by self-driving trucks, but they are surveilled like 24/7 while working, and it seriously decreased the quality of their work. So I'm just curious to sort of, what are your thoughts about moving beyond just job displacement, as Brandon mentioned?
Any answers? Who wants to answer? Any thoughts?
If you want, I can start, but some of you complement later. So I think I will say that it's part of this, in my mind, it's part of this fear of being left out or in a way feel kind of alienated in the task. I used to have, when I did my shop talk, I used to have examples in LA, for instance, of the hotel workers saying that we don't want to have a manager that is just a computer, like we don't really have a human. So I do think that there is something that we should explore moving further about the conditions of these workers, and even AI, even the effects are not only on the displacement side, they are also on the conditions, the work conditions that these people are having, and the surveillance and all this lack of human interactions with your boss and things like that. But that will be my first reaction to that comment. But now, I don't know if you want to add something.
I don't have direct evidence on the second question. The closest I have to direct evidence on the first part about how underlying economic strength matters is when we did our survey in 2020 and we did our survey in 2022, the degree to which people, the nominal levels of preferences for transfers versus backpedaling policies change. So that kind of ambient beliefs about the economy really shaped the way, the levels of support for things, which we actually took as both good because it makes sense, but also encouraging about the theoretical model, because the theoretical model said there's just tons of stuff that affects your levels of support for policies, but we can make crisp predictions about your relative support for those policies.
I guess on Baba's question about looking beyond the impact of workers, like beyond salary and labor displacement, I think many people in this room are actually starting to think about this issue. But I would say like on the specific topics on like populism, on like far right voting, I feel like there's still a lot of like value to think about first and foremost the salary and the displacement part first. But in terms of quality of work, I think it's actually very interesting how workers appraise how their jobs have been changing. Of course, there are different types of technology that are being used by workers, forced on them or not. Like self-driving cars, of course, it is changing, the whole piece of their jobs. But a lot of manufacturing workers that I've talked to, they're actually not very upset about technological change. If you believe what I said with the pilot data, foreign competition is one of the reasons why that shapes their thinking, but also just how it changed their day-to-day task. As like we talked about in the earlier Q&A, there are workers who talk about how they used to be required to physically lift something up. They no longer have to do that. There are manufacturing workers who talked about how it's like very taxing to work in southern China in summer, but then because the machines have to be in this dust-free, air-conditioned environment, they now work in dust-free, air-conditioned environment. So I do think that there's room for us to think about technologies changing sort of workers' day-to-day experience at their jobs, and also, of course, Philippines sort of workers, like how also they interact with other workers and sort of and the firm itself as well. But I do think that that's kind of more ongoing work that we're all kind of doing right now. Thank you. We have time.
So, first of all, thank you all for a very interesting panel. My name is Yotam Margalit. My question is this, and I think it's directed to all three papers, so to Valentina's results and to Michelle's experiment and to Stephen's, both the model and kind of the initial results. I'm curious about what do you think the main contribution or what you're interested in actually explaining? Are we asking a question about human behavior in general, or is it about explaining a political phenomenon that we're actually seeing? And the distinction is this. So we could think about, are we interested, say, in a very specific case where somebody is actually losing their job because of it's now being automated, or some robot is coming into the plant and replacing that job, and we're interested in a specific circumstance of that case, would that individual change their views on a certain policy, on politics? Or are we now interested in seeing some broad phenomenon, in this case, say, how people vote, or the support for the far right, or general support for certain restrictive AI regulation, etc. And now we're trying to explain the overall sort of distribution or variation in society, and we've got what we think is an answer, an important answer for that distribution. And so the question is ultimately, are we now trying to tease out and prove that a certain mechanism can have some effect in very specific circumstances, or is your interest generally in explaining the broader phenomenon of a distribution or variation across society in those views, and you think you have an answer that gives a substantial purchase on that question? Thanks.
I can start. So my motivation was more on understanding the phenomenon that we are seeing. Like for me, it's hard to understand. Initially, it was hard to understand why right-wing politicians, in particular populist politicians, are having such a success on targeting these people. And that was like my motivation. And then I think that part of the explanation is on the economy. I mean, like as a political economist, that's what I think when I look at these phenomenons. And I think that automation is the most important and the most the economic phenomena that is triggering more labor market polarization and generating, and with the ability or the capacity to generate more inequality. So I think that's why, even though I am interested in the political phenomenon and understanding why is this right-wing populism increasing, and the reason is I think that it is a threat for democracy, and there are many other consequences that will come after that. But then if I look at the reasons why this is happening, I think that it is all based on these economic explanations, but not them alone. So that's why I have this non-material consequence and the frameworks. But that's my motivation. Like I had a hard time understanding why these type of leaders can really speak with these type of workers, like the exposed workers. And this is just one part. Like in another part of the work, I look at the type of targeting they can do and the type of strategies they use. And I think that, but it's more about like why this is happening, which I think that I am scared about that. Especially as an immigrant, I don't need cats or pets or anything, but I think that it's part of the fear, and that's the motivation. But it's more an empirical problem in the society. At least my motivation. Yeah.
I think we can be interested in sort of a variety of different things. Is that as individuals in society who are in the workplace, we are faced with a technological shock. I guess depending on what occupation you have, the shock is larger or smaller. For me, I'm interested in sort of how people interact with technology in their workplace. And I alluded to some examples like truck drivers, they're actively protesting self-driving cars. We have dock workers actively, I guess maybe not at this moment, but in the recent past, they've go on strike or threatened to go on strike because of autonomous ports. We have maybe university professors thinking about how to combat AI use or how to augment AI use in their classes. So I think there's a very tight link between us as workers and how we interact with technology. I think that's worth studying. I think as political scientists, then we're interested in whether this changing attitude actually affects people's voting. I think Stephen's answer at the very beginning is that that's not the predominant answer that we're giving in political science. It can also might affect policy, and I think that there's a long-standing debate of how much public opinion affects policy. So I don't want to go into that debate, but it's there. So I do think that we can be interested in technology in a variety of different ways. You can be at the worker level, their interaction with their firms, and then think more deeper is that if they have attitudinal shifts, to what extent does that affect politics around us? And I think this panel sort of speaks to sort of the second part a little bit more.
I think I would be firmly in camp 2. We are meteorologists thinking about the ways political winds can blow. And I say that for 2 reasons. If I think globalization, the modal US worker is working in non-tradables and is minimally exposed to globalization shocks no matter what he or she actually believes. If anything, I would bet dollars to donuts she's a net winner, yet we still see the winds blowing in a particular way. The modal worker is probably even less exposed to automation. Or I don't want to say even less, but the modal US worker is also not especially exposed to automation. They're not going to have to stare at the robot arm that took their job. Maybe there will be automation of their email stuff. And if I don't know if this name is like heretical now in this room, but like if we believe like recent Achimaglu takes, this is all overblown anyways. And so in my mind, I want to know kind of what are the folk wisdoms people have in their mental models of how the economy and world works, because that will help us think about the way political winds will blow.
Thank you. So I've not been a good chair because we're already like 15 minutes. But okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take off some time from the lunch break since it's so long. So please take 10 minutes, get your coffee, go to the bathroom, and then we'll reconvene at 11:10. So let's thank Valentina, Nicole, and Stephen again. Thank you.